Welcome, everyone. Good evening. And thank you for joining Courage California's California Midterms Halftime Report tonight. So I know we are counter-programmed against the World Cup. So I understand if some of you are splitting your attention this evening or maybe even watching after your team wins. But appreciate you guys spending time with us. I'm very excited to dive into what we're going to talk about this evening. But first, a quick introduction. I'm Irene Gao. I'm the Executive Director of Courage California, and I am entering my 7th year in that role. Fingers crossed we see a few more changes. It's been quite a 7 years. But right now, we're about 16 days away from when we're going to have the official results of the June 2nd primary election. And believe it or not, we are only about 3 months away from when voters around the state of California are going to receive our ballots for the November 3rd general election. So this is a really great time for us to dive a little bit deeper into the results of the primary election and start to preview the dynamics that we're seeing heading into the general election. So this evening, we will be joined by colleagues from the California Environmental Voters, Chispa, Initiate Justice Action, and Power California Action to unpack what happened. So going beyond sort of the headlines and the top lines, and also talk about what we're getting ready for now. And to answer the question in the chat, we will be sharing the recording of this town hall, and it will be posted on our YouTube channel as well. And so we'll make sure folks have links to that. And if there are any resources that people share, we'll be sure to send out links and any follow-up information as well. So we will have dedicated time for questions and answers after sort of the main content and conversation. But we also welcome questions anytime. So feel free to drop in your questions in the chat and we may end answering some of them as we go. Excuse me. But first, I have a question for all of you. We'd love to know, so what was your top priority race this primary election? So we know that there were a lot of races up and down the ballot. So state, federal, local, county, and some ballot measures as well. And so we also love to know, like, what were the races that you were sort of paying most attention to? What were you interested in? And what races kind of got you excited in terms of, potentially the field of candidates or just what the outcome? All right, so I see a lot of focus on the gubernatorial race. Definitely understandable since we had 61 candidates. And it took up the whole entire first page of folks' ballot. But I also see some interest in congressional races, state legislative, local races, and local ballot measures as well. And sadly, not as much interest in other statewide races, but also a little bit understandable to that. So just give you a sense here. So again, like more than half of folks really were focused on the gubernatorial race. Again, not a surprise there.
Okay. No.
And that was definitely the race that got the most press attention here. All right, so we'll definitely dive a little bit deeper into the gubernatorial race and some of these other races. But I also want, if you're interested, if folks want, we'd love to also have you share what were some of the specific races that you were really excited about, or maybe which candidates that were running, whether locally, statewide, or federally, that you were excited to vote for this election as well. So if folks want to share that in the chat, I'm just going to take a quick second. So the sort of format for this town hall is I'm going to sort of go through a quick overview of the results statewide, and then I'll invite the partners that I mentioned onto a panel, and then fingers crossed, I'm also hoping that one of our special guests, one of our endorsed candidates, who unfortunately didn't make it into the general election, but who we were still very excited to endorse and we're proud of endorsing, for Lieutenant Governor Michael Tubbs. I'm hoping he's able to join us as well. He is traveling, and so, fingers crossed he ends up in a good place and has good enough Wi-Fi to be able to join us. It's really fun to see what candidates you guys are mentioning here. in the chat. Yes, lots of interesting races happening in Los Angeles. I see some folks here who are focused on races in the Orange County area, some statewide. Glad to see some mention of endorsed candidates, but also glad to see mention of also other progressive candidates or key seats that we needed to win. Great. Keep sharing these in the chat. We're always really fascinated by these kinds of these data points and hearing from people directly. All right. So let's sort of like the headlines, the top lines of the results. So I'm going to start here by showing sort of voter turnout. I always tell people, while I'm really deeply invested and our team is really deeply invested in results up and down the ballot, in some ways, the numbers that I'm always looking forward to most are what does voter turnout look like? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, at Courage California, our hope is that as many voters as possible turn out. And in such an election like this, there was a lot of uncertainty as to, if folks were going to turn out and who was going to turn out and who was not. So what I want to show you here, so here is the website of the California Secretary of State. What I love about their results page is that they have this map of turnout. So as you'll see here, nearly 41% of voters turned out statewide, which is great. That is the highest primary election turnout that we've had since the 2020 presidential primary, and it's the highest non-presidential primary turnout since 1998, which was about 42%. So this is really exciting because turnout, as you can see here, has mostly been in the 30s for non-presidential primaries. But I think it says a lot that people understand what's at stake and were either excited to turn out to vote or sort of understood the importance of voting for some of these key races. And so you'll see here that on the map, the darker blue counties are the ones where voter turnout was higher, and the lighter ones are where turnout was a little bit lower. So across the state, we have a range where Amador County had the highest turnout at 60%, and the lowest turnout was in Imperial County for 27%. And then all the other counties were sort of in between. But you'll see here that a lot of the lower turnout counties are sort of more inland and especially concentrated in the Central Valley, which is the reason why Courage California works a lot with groups in the Central Valley to turn out these voters. I also want to share too, so this is information from Political Data Incorporated. The team behind PDI is also the team that helped to redraw the maps for the Prop 50 redistricting and has been involved in redistricting and sort of data analysis around elections before. So folks probably got really familiar with Paul Mitchell from PDI during the Proposition 50 special election, because again, he was one of the folks who led the redistricting and was sort of the spokesperson for that. So you'll see here, not all of the ballots are accounted for yet on PDI, but this still gives a detailed analysis, which I think is really helpful to look at. So if we look here at how turnout was by party, you'll see that proportionally, like Republicans and Democrats actually turned out at the same rate, roughly the same rate. But what's concerning, and a number we always pay attention to, is that no party preference and other party voters turned out at a lower rate, and a significantly lower rate. So that's something that we want to, again, focus on changing for the general election, and again, why Courage and other partners focus a lot on these no party preference voters. I should say no party preference means like there are folks who definitely lean more liberal, folks who definitely lean more conservative, and folks who are kind of in the middle. But certainly from the polls that we've done in previous years, we've certainly seen that NPV voters are very values driven, very issues driven, and so can be motivated to vote. We just have to get them excited and turn them out to vote. And then you'll see here by age that this is not a surprise. This is also like by party, very similar to other primary elections where the electorate skewed definitely older. And you'll see here that, especially among younger age bands, that turnout was pretty low. So 18 to 34-year-olds turned out at a 21% rate, which is definitely something we want to work on. And then lastly, here by race and ethnicity, again, very similar to trends for primary elections, the electorate skewed whiter. And we definitely see some lower turnout amongst Latino voters. And then really quickly, I'll also show you, I also have fun with this as well. They also show sort of what turnout looks like compared between 2022 and 2026. And so you'll see here that even though we would like to see turnout a little bit more proportional by party, by age, and by race and ethnicity, that the 2026 turnout was actually better. So turnout was better in terms of proportions than 2022. So that is always promising to see. Then the other thing I want to mention that's really key as well. So even though all ballots are in and ballots have been counted, there still are a lot of ballots that still need to be cured. So oftentimes ballots are rejected because the signatures don't match with what's on file, or there's no signature on the envelope at all. And I just want to give you a sense of what that scale is. So for this election so far, there's over 61,000 ballots that are left to be cured around the state. And so you'll see here, a lot of them are based in the really big counties like Los Angeles and Orange County and Riverside and San Diego. And this is significant because obviously if you have this many ballots that are uncured, some of these ballots could actually make the difference in some of these key races. So I want to encourage folks, if you got a notice from your county elections office or you know folks who did, please encourage folks to cure their ballots by the deadline that's listed on their notice. All right. And just to give you a sense of like how close some races are, some of the races that we're tracking, some of our endorsed candidates are behind by a few hundred votes. And then one race that we're watching, a Glendale school board race, is actually tied. So each candidate has about 4,500 votes. So just a couple of people curing their ballots in that race could mean that one candidate actually triumphs over the other. So it makes a difference. So now to talk about the actual races. So as folks know, in these state races, that most of these state races are going to be Democrat versus Republican. So that's the case for most of the seats. And then even in the state superintendent seat, which is nonpartisan, it is essentially a Democrat, like a liberal labor-backed candidate versus a right-wing extremist candidate. There are a couple exceptions. So in the statewide races, we are going to see 3 Dem-on-Dem races, and that's in the insurance commissioner race and the Board of Equalization races in districts 2 and 3. And I should mention too, in the Dem versus Republican races, those are all expected to be races in which the Democrats should safely win. But, still closely watching those just in case. So the other big one is obviously congressional races. So right now, Democrats hold 43 of the 52 congressional seats. All of the Democratic incumbents are in a good position for re-election, and that includes in the seats that we flipped in 2003. So we flipped CD 13 in Central Valley, CD 27 in Los Angeles, and CD 45 in Orange County. Those in all those races, the Dems have about like mid 50 to upper 50s of the votes. And so that's a really good position to be in the primary, and that's very promising for the general election. And as folks know, after Prop 50, 5 Republican seats were redistricted to be more competitive. And in those races, the Dems hold a 53% to 64% of the vote. And you'll see here in what I've listed, there's actually 6, and that is because Kevin Kiley, who is now running as a no party preference, chose a seat that was formerly a Democratic seat. And so that's why I included it on this list, even though it wasn't originally Republican held, but it is still a competitive seat. So in other words, we are well positioned to flip all of the seats that we have the potential to flip for Prop 50. And then in terms of the state legislature, we have Democratic supermajorities, and so we have 75% Dems in both the state Senate and the state assembly. So that's always been, quote unquote safe. Um, in the state Senate, 20 of the 40 seats are up for election this cycle, and in the state assembly, all 80. So you'll see here in the state Senate, all the Democratic incumbents are positioned to hold their seats, and we have the potential to flip up to 4 seats. Those 4 seats sort of vary in terms of where their Democratic versus Republican registration is at and where the primary election results are, but there are 4 liberal to progressive candidates running in those seats. And then in the state Senate side, there's also 2 Dem on Dem open seats to watch, and those are both in the Los Angeles area. And that's to replace Senator Ben Allen, who's running for insurance commissioner, and Senator Maria Elena Moraza, who is running for LA Board of Supervisors. And then on the state assembly side, very similarly, the Dem incumbents are look like they're going to hold their seats pretty easily. And then there's potential to flip up to 7 seats. And what is really exciting about these 7 seats is in a lot of these seats, we're talking about Democrats who are on the more progressive side of things. So these aren't necessarily, moderate or centrist Dems who are trying to flip Republican seats. These are opportunities for us to flip the seats from Republican all the way to progressive. And then there are also 3 Dem on Dem seats to watch. One is 8012 in North Bay. One is 8066 in the LA area, and one is 8068 in the Orange County. So again, some very exciting and promising results on the state legislative side. And I just want to quickly remind folks is what's so important about the state legislature and why I'm excited about progressive candidates is oftentimes we are not getting progressive bills passed because of because of moderate Democrats, not just because of the Republicans, but the corporate-backed Democrats in the state legislature. So it's very exciting that we can actually start to turn our legislature to be more progressive this cycle as well. And then just flagging here, some folks mentioned a couple of these races in the chat. Of course, there were some local races that are really exciting that will be really interesting to watch how they develop for the general election. So to see a few of those in Los Angeles. There's one in Orange County, which will sort of determine the majority makeup of the Board of Supervisors there. And of course, there's a great progressive candidate running for Sacramento County Board of Supervisors, Dr. Flo Kofer, who ran for Sacramento mayor in 2024. I also want to mention a couple local ballot measures. I know that there were more than beyond these 4, but just really notable that in LA County, we passed Measure ER to raise the sales tax for the next 5 years to provide funding for local health departments and services, funding that was essentially cut by HR 1. And then in San Francisco, there was sort of the battling Measure C and D that ended up both failing. Measure D was one that we were watching closely because that would have imposed a tax on companies that had the highest executive to median pay. And then, of course, I think a really notable one is in Monterey Park in Los Angeles County. The voters there passed Measure NDC, and that is to put a moratorium on the development of data centers in the city. And that was significant because the passage rate, if I remember correctly, was about 85%. So it passed, and it passed by an overwhelming majority. So now this was a big headline and a lot of reporting around money in politics. So folks here on this call, Courage members know that money in politics has always been a huge factor, especially since Citizens United was passed and essentially allowed like no limit to spending, especially by corporations and executives. And we've seen how that has affected and really shifted how politics and elections work over several cycles. And we definitely saw it at play in this cycle. So of course, Courage had endorsed Tom Steyer for governor, and he was definitely by far the top spender of all. So as folks saw, he spent over 200 million of his own money on his own campaign for governor. But I think just as big of a story, and I think one just as significant, is of course, in addition to the big money that usually comes from industries and special interests like oil and gas, law enforcement and real estate and big corporations, there was like a new scale of tech money that was infused in this election. And that both came from tech corporations as well as tech executives. And these are folks who had funds or were able to spend like several million. So you'll see here in the chart here, this just goes to show you that just in the gubernatorial race, like you see here, Tom Steyer's, this is just on the independent expenditure side. So for each candidate race, there are limits to how much people can contribute to these candidates' own campaigns. But there is no limit to how much they can contribute to what are called independent expenditure committees. And those are committees that are run completely separate from the candidates and aren't allowed to coordinate with the candidates. But because there's no limit to the amount of money you spend, that's where you sort of see like this huge balloon of support or opposition money that can really dictate and set the tone for a race. So you'll see here in just the gubernatorial race that there were several million spent in support and then quite a bit of money spent in opposition. So for all the money that Tom Steyer spent on his own campaign, he was also the spending against him, especially from corporations like PG&E and tech companies, greatly outpaced the spending for any other candidate. And you'll see here just an example too of like, oftentimes these donors are giving in several places or to several committees. And so they're getting very invested and they're coordinating and they're talking to each other. And so this is really important. So as an example, two really significant PACs that had a lot of influence this election were Grow California and California Leads. And these were predominantly funded by tech corporations and tech executives. So Grow California spent $14 million to support and oppose state legislative candidates. And they mostly focused on investing in safe Democratic districts to boost the more moderate Democrats and block progressive Democrats. And they had mixed results. And I will say that it seems like the pattern of the progressives who overcame some of that outside funding to make it into the general election, they're all locally elected officials who had established track records and visibility in their districts. So in some ways, they were probably a little bit inoculated from the outside spending. That was definitely not the case for some of the candidates who didn't have that same sort of visible track record. And in some ways, the outside spending got to define them in a much bigger way than they were able to do themselves or oppose. And then similarly, California Lead spent $7 million to support similarly more moderate state legislative candidates. And there was a lot of overlap between the California Leads and the Grow California folks. I also want to note too that many of the candidates that they spent against are progressive women of color. And then just to give you a quick snapshot of what it was like just in one race, one of the most expensive races this cycle was in Assembly District 67, and that was in the Orange County. There was $9 million in outside spending there to support Democratic candidate Mark Polito and oppose the labor leader Otto Briceño. So they supported Mark with $5 million in outside spending and opposed Otto with $3 million. And Otto was a Courage California endorsed candidate. And then just right next door in Assembly District 68, $2 million was spent against progressive Jesse Lopez, and $2 million was spent also against progressive candidate Fatima Iqbal Zubair in Los Angeles. So again, like this is a scale of spending that is been creeping up each election cycle, and this is getting to the point where it's very difficult to figure out how to support grassroots and progressive candidates because they have to compete against that kind of outside spending. But we don't necessarily have to match them dollar for dollar, but it definitely helps. Oh, so I'm apologize that a couple of these images aren't showing up on this slide. So lastly, I just want to wrap up really quickly that Courage California. So we endorse progressive candidates every cycle up and down the ballot. And this cycle in 2026, we endorsed 15 candidates for the primary election. Eight have advanced to the general election. You'll see here for Attorney General in several of the congressional races, a few of the state legislative races, and then, of course, folks mentioned Marisa Roy for Los Angeles City Attorney in the chat as well. So we also had some mixed results, but very excited about all of our candidates and very proud of all of our endorsements as well. So I also am curious if folks want to share. Let's see. Yeah, just 1 minute. Sorry about that. If folks want to also lift up or share any other races or candidates or any election results that they were really excited about as well, please feel free to do that. All right. So I believe we have Michael Tubbs, as I mentioned, here on the call.
I'm here.
Yay. Hi. All right. So as I mentioned, Courage endorsed 15 candidates. And when we were endorsing candidates, we always look for candidates who, of course, have a progressive agenda. So they have good policy ideas across climate, workers' rights, LGBTQ rights. And we also look for candidates who have a track record of either local elected office or as like community organizing or some work in the community. So for us, it was sort of a no-brainer to endorse all of our candidates, but I was especially excited to endorse, and we were especially excited to endorse Michael Tubbs for Lieutenant Governor. So folks may know Michael Tubbs, not just as a candidate for Lieutenant Governor, but also as the founder of Mayors for a Guaranteed Income, and also the founder of End Poverty in California, which is a statewide nonprofit here. Also as the former mayor and city council member of Stockton and the youngest one, I believe, in the nation at the time. And he was also a special advisor to Governor Gavin Newsom for economic mobility. So beyond all these titles, we know he's just been thoroughly engaged in the communities, but also he represents California communities that aren't always represented at the state level and in state leadership. And so, Michael, we were really excited to endorse you. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I know you're traveling, so I appreciate you being with us. Um, I'd love to I'd love to have you talk about like what motivated you to run for lieutenant governor in the first place, and then what did Courage California's endorsement mean to you?
Well, first, let me just say thank you, Irene, Courage California staff, and all the Courage California members. I'm so incredibly honored to have been your endorsed candidate for Lieutenant Governor, particularly because, to answer your question, why I decided to run, I think in California, we just need to have a lot more courage. It makes no sense to me that California is tied with Louisiana for the highest poverty rate in this country. And yes, Donald Trump is bad, but Donald Trump didn't do that. It's not Donald Trump's fault. It's not MAGA's fault that no one can afford housing or childcare or much of anything anywhere in the state. And I think it's going to take courage from Democrats to fight against Donald Trump, but also fight with each other to actually move the ball forward and prove that our values aren't just talking points, aren't just slogans, aren't just memes, but they actually mean a material difference in the lives of working people. I also ran for lieutenant governor because I am worried about the future, particularly when we think about AI and technology and the lack of government leadership. I don't want to live in a world that's created by Dario and Sam. Like I was joking with someone earlier. I was like, well, it's like in high school whose party would you go to? Would you go to the party thrown by Sam Altman and you don't no we don't they're smart people, brilliant people, but they're not elected by all of us to determine how the next 50 years of this country goes, to determine what the new social contract looks like, to determine what the future work looks like, because they're unelected. But very few elected officials have the courage to come up with ideas that meet the scale of what we're seeing, to talk about the need for all of us to have equity stakes in these companies, for all of us to have ownership, and for prosperity to be shared, to talk about having a floor for they keep talking about automation as if it's a foregone conclusion. No, we could put a floor as to you can't automate. You know, there's things we can do, and I'm just worried that without leadership, we'll be caught flat-footed, and the communities that are going to be hit the hardest are the communities who are already suffering. So that's why I decided to run for lieutenant governor. And although we were successful in that campaign, your endorsement meant so much. We were able to win over 1 million votes. Not bad from a little mayor from Stockton, California. We won LA County, the largest county in the state. Not bad. We won San Joaquin County, the county I came from. The county that was mostly red because Gloria was number two. And so that was interesting. We lost Sac County by like 2 points. We got really close in Alameda. We won the city of Oakland. We won the city of Sacramento. We got 21% in San Francisco. And all that despite the governor endorsing somebody else and going against the city state treasurer um, San Francisco. And I think if there's any lessons, it's that I have to do, or folks not from these areas who are thinking have to do a better job of building relationships, particularly in like Santa Clara County, San Mateo County. And then of course we know Orange County, San Diego County are going to be or still have work to do. But no, I'm so honored, so thankful. I hope that we focus in on the races that we have to win in November in California, and also continue to push and fight for a California that doesn't just talk about issues, but actually solves them. And then totally unscripted. And lastly, I do think, particularly given some of what we saw in New York, some of the dynamics in my race and other races, we should at least have a conversation about what the relationship is between progressives and democratic socialists, and how do we make sure we're not cannibalizing. Because I maintain, but for a democratic socialist in my race who got 7% of the vote, I would be in the runoff. Right? So I think that's part of the conversation we have to have about what's the converse like how do we what's the coalition that includes or doesn't include that includes democratic socialists, and how do we think about um that relationship? Because I can see this happening more and more, because in California there's enough progressives to win, but there's not enough progressives to win if three progressives are running in the race. That's just we it's not there yet. But
Yeah.
there is
Yep.
enough there. There is enough there. Like the theory of the case is correct. So that's something I'm going to spend some time thinking on over the next several months as well. But again, thank you so much for your support. I'll still be getting on everyone's nerves, talking about we have to end poverty, talking about
Yeah.
how we need to
Yep.
all have equity stakes in AI companies, and given the results in LA County, probably will focus more on LA County work and continuing to build momentum there.
Right. That makes sense. I mean, I do want to go back to something you said, which is sort of like needing the leadership in the moment. Because I do think when I had conversations with voters, a lot of people were very focused on what's directly in front of us. So, like this fighting against Trump. But, for, an office like lieutenant governor, this person will be serving beyond the Trump administration. So, like you said, it's also about what are we doing that's bigger than just defending and protecting? Because California has the like responsibility and the opportunity to be on the front end of defining like what the state and what the nation looks like after Trump, like they're still there. And a second thing I want to flag too is the advantage of running when you're younger is obviously folks would love to see you run again. So like just pinning that for future thought there as well.
Well, wait, can I say one more thing, Irene? Actually, on that point,
Yeah,
I
of
think
course.
another learning from this race is that when we talk about building a bench, particularly a bit like because we do a good job at legislature, like assembly, state, senate, but at the executive levels, like governor, lieutenant governor, secretary of state, treasurer, control, like I think there's more that we can do, but I think part of it is doing the work of voter education as to like why lieutenant governors matters. Because I think so much attention was focused on the governor's race, rightfully so, it's the governor, that we weren't able to break out enough to get people to care about like actually for this project, for the progressive project, it's going to be important who's at number two. Because we might not get a number one this time, as maybe as progressive as some people like, but we could build like so we think about building the bench, I think it's also talking about these other key positions and how it's important to have our folks there. So it's a lower lift to get to the governor's mansion. So it's a lower lift to get to Congress. So it's a lower lift to get to where we want folks to be.
Yeah. Well, and then kind of related to that, how do you think people should be thinking about the lieutenant governor race and like engaging with it? Because I will say too, at least with state legislators, they have district offices. There's like set times and places where you can make sure you're interfacing. But with a lot of the statewide officers, there's not necessarily that same structure or support put in place for people to really engage. So how would you encourage folks like engage in these candidates, but also engage in these offices and especially specifically for the lieutenant governor?
Yeah, well, the lieutenant governor's real power comes from the UC, CSU, and Community College Board, so those regent meetings. And then also from sitting on the State Lands Commission. And the State Lands Commission is interesting because you're one of three people. The lieutenant governor is one of three people that dictates whether offshore drilling is allowed or not. But also dictates what do we do with all the state land? Can we do renewable energy? Is there a way to put this asset to work? Can we build affordable housing? And same with the UCCSU community college system. So I always tell people who are still interested in lieutenant governor's race, the best way to apply pressure or to see some like actual tangible results is to demand more housing for students. You would be, I think that the California Student Aid Commission came out with a report 2 years ago that said like 50% of California higher education students are hungry and about 35% are housing insecure, are homeless, going to college. Like no one should be homeless, period, including folks who go to school, right? And the lieutenant governor actually has to be a voice on the board of regents because the board of regents is very sleepy. It's all donors who get appointed there mostly, and they just happen to be in the game. They're a regent. It's not bad. You can't be evil as a regent, right? You're a regent for the best university system. But so many things have gone undone, including housing. As we think about housing being the biggest issue in California, the land that UCCSU Community College sits on has to be utilized to build housing, not just for students, but also for workers. Because there's hundreds of thousands of people who work in these systems as well. So that's how I would think about engaging, particularly with that office. But also that office is a bully pulpit. So we think about courage. That office, you're not running the bureaucracy. You're not in charge of wildfire response. You should be a very clear moral voice about the issues of the day. You should be holding the next governor accountable to make sure in this time of budget austerity, we're not balancing the budget on the backs of poor people. We're not reneging on our promises to the undocumented community. That we're not kowtowing to Trump. Like the lieutenant governor could do that because you have time and space. So we should also push and press the lieutenant governor to do that work.
Yeah, I appreciate that because I know people always give the hot takes after elections of like, do we need a lieutenant governor? What do they do? And it's when you say like this, it becomes so clear because the focus of the role is much narrower and not as significant as the significant in scope as a governor. And so because of that, you're able to potentially move more and have an influential voice. And on the Board of Regents, I know that, the student body is not particularly well represented. And so Lieutenant Governor has a really strong allyship role to play in that as well. So
And also should push for more students to be on the board of
yes,
regents.
yes,
Like at least there's one right now. It could be at least get three. Like what are we doing?
yes. Yeah. And I know there's an effort to like double it to like two,
Two.
but that's still, again, another conversation, but more. So you mentioned a little bit of like what comes next for you. Like, so say a little bit more about that and like both in terms of what you're thinking about for the general election, but just sort of broader because, you know, a lot of us, and when I say us, I include Kirsch, like some of our endorsed candidates didn't make it into the general. And so it feels like there may be some things on our progressive agenda that are not likely going to be achieved at the state level because we're not going to have the elected officials there to push it. So how do you also see yourself like continuing to push this progressive agenda in the role that you have?
Yeah, no, I think what I learned in this campaign is that I'm very blessed to be very clearly progressive in values, but for some reason, some non-progressive people really like me as well. And being able to transverse those worlds and get things done, I think is a real value add. So I know for the work I do with Epic, we're going to be definitely being budget hawks and just making
Yep.
sure. because now we have a new governor. It hasn't been 8 years. It's a new governor, so our opportunity to assert more power. So thinking
Yes.
more strategically with our partners in labor and others about sort of where are we holding the line and where are you applying
Yep.
pressure. Number two, I'm obsessed with we have to get this AI question right because I'm not a techno optimist or a techno pessimist. I'm like, it depends on what we do. We have agency. So I'm really obsessed with making sure we create the guardrails, the frameworks where everyone benefits, where we accentuate the bad, where we accentuate the good, mitigate the bad, and we think about what the social contract looks like. I still believe that everyone should own their data. I still believe we should all have equity stakes in these AI companies. And I do believe we have to like really have a regulatory process by which we iterate, try, but don't just let this thing just happen to us. Particularly when you think of like job loss and automation. There's a report from Brookings Institute last week that compared conservative estimates of the impact of AI on women and women of color to what happened to men in deindustrialization. I mean, during after NAFTA, and I'm like
Yep.
I've not had no one say that because so much has been about like no coding jobs. So I'm obsessed with getting that right and fighting on that. And then I live in LA now, so I'll be in LA County, very progressive county. I had no idea how progressive LA County was. Like I got 18.4%. And the Democratic Socialists, who got 7% statewide, got 13% in LA. So 31%
Wow.
of the LA
Yep.
County vote in the primary was like
Yeah.
left, far left progressive. Like that's like there's something to build there. So I'll be continuing our work on poverty, but focus on LA County.
That's great. Thanks so much. I really appreciate it because I know the response to tech and AI right now is a little piecemeal. So like having this sort of blueprint or like bigger picture and how it all fits together is going to be so important.
Or at least try it. We gotta try something. That's what I
Yeah,
keep
we
telling
got,
people. Like we gotta
I
try.
know.
Because the only people trying right now are Sam Altman and Dario, and that's not good for all of us. And I
No.
and I know them. I'm not a hater, but it's just like that's not they're not in elected office for a reason. That they're not the way they think isn't the way how they don't always think about all of us or don't have
Yes.
experience working with all of us. So anyway.
Yeah. But I mean, they may not be in elected office, but they're certainly, they and their colleagues are doing what they can to, get their influence in politics in
So we
every
have
way.
to
So, yep, that's right. All right. Thank you so much for joining us, Michael. Safe rest of your travels. Thank you so much. We are so proud of our endorsement of you. Very excited to continue working with you. As you mentioned, there's still a lot of work to be done, and a lot of that work is going to honestly happen outside of capitals, outside of city halls, and a lot of it is just going to happen in our communities and with folks working in concert with our elected officials. So thank you so much. Yeah,
absolutely. The last thing I'll say, Irene, is that's the sad part because I was like, I was thinking about this. I was like, you know what? Lieutenant Governor in some ways would have been a little bit easier than what we have to do now. Like getting in office sometimes, that's like the hard stuff happens outside the office. So I'll be out in the streets with y'all. But,
yeah.
but good to see you guys. And again, I'm so thankful for your endorsement. And looking forward to staying in touch.
Thank you, Michael. All right. So obviously, somebody to keep watching and continue to work with. As folks mentioned, he's thoughtful, he's powerful, he's really inspiring. And it's also great to see, somebody who comes from, a place that's not the Bay Area or LA run for statewide office as well. I should say that's also a really big, exciting part of his race as well when he ran. All right. So now I want to bring on a few partners to sort of unpack some of the election results a little bit more as well and start to, again, sort of look forward to what November looks like. So you got a little bit of sort of what the top line results are, but let's dig a little bit deeper. So I want to welcome a few folks. So we have Matt Abularach-Macias who's the campaign and organizing deputy director, sorry, at California Environmental Voters. We also have Marisa Moraza, who's the political director at Power California Action. We have Taina Vargas, who is the founder and executive director at Initiate Justice Action. And we also have Boomer Vicente, who's the policy and political director at Chispa. So full disclosure, you likely know this already. These are folks that we work with on a consistent basis, whose like political instincts we trust, and who are on the ground and in communities that we always want to turn out to vote. And so excited to have you all with us. So to start, of course, I'll have you guys, if you can introduce yourselves, quickly give folks a sense of who your organizations are, and just like a quick explainer about what your organization did for the election.
Sorry.
So, Matt, you want to start?
Yes, hi everybody. I'm Abularach-Macias. I'm actually a political and organizing director, so I am director, Irene, for California Environmental Voters.
Yay,
Um,
upgrade.
yeah, no, and our work in the elections is pretty vast, actually. And we are trying to achieve a couple things, right? Making sure that we have statewide officers, especially a governor, who are going to prioritize or have a vision for climate justice, in California. We also are working to win a majority of climate justice votes in California, meaning at least 21 senators and 41 assembly members who prioritize and or will support in votes and or take leadership on climate justice. And we also endorse in congressional races. And so we are making sure that we have a governing majority in Congress that is pro-environment, pro-climate. Um, and then in some instances, we also work on do some local elections. And for example, in Marin County, we supported Magali Lameta, who won her seat, I think, outright now. It's a very, very tight race, but she got 50% in the primary. And then in Orange County, we endorsed Supervisor Foley for reelection and Connor Trout to get elected to the county board of supervisors there, and Rex Richardson in Long Beach. So we do some local as well. And ultimately, what our goal is to make sure that we have leaders in place who are going to move forward a vision of California that is prioritizing uh, addressing the climate crisis, but putting equity and justice at the center of it. Yeah, I mean, that's a quick snippet of how we engage in elections and what our work is.
Thanks, Matt. And you would think it's a sort of a given that if you're running for office in California, especially as a Democrat, that it's a given that you're a climate champion. But we'll talk more about why that is definitely not the case. Yes, there's more behind that.
Yes.
All
Yeah.
right. Marisa, you want to quickly introduce yourself?
Sure thing. Hi, everyone. My name is Marisa Moraza, pronouns she or hers. I'm the political director with Power City Action, and I am based in Fresno, so representing the Central Valley. With Power City Action, we are an alliance of youth organizing and youth serving organizations, so focusing on youth power building, building youth power and mobilizing young voters of color and their families in order to create a California where everyone can call home. But with that, our goal is to ensure that we're building a progressive California. And in order to do that, we need to be investing in inland California. So that and what's considered the fishhook region of the state. So that includes the Central Valley, the Inland Empire, Orange County, and portions of the Central Coast as well. So with Power City Action, we do endorse candidates across the state where we have alliance partners and membership bases of our own. However, we have been doubling down efforts in the Central Valley. I'm born and raised here in the Central Valley in Tulare, California, in Tulare County specifically. And it's an area that's often been overlooked. It's considered a conservative stronghold, but there's been a movement of young folks over the past decade that have been building a bench of power. And so it's important that we're continuing to support these folks, but build an activated base of voters that includes young people. But we know that in order to get to this progressive California, we need to build strong multiracial, multi-generational bases. So for the primary election, we specifically doubled down on a congressional race, Congressional District 22, with Randy Villegas moving on to the general election. Yes, let's applaud. And then also state races in Fresno County, Assembly District 31. And then I also want to name, which we'll talk about later, but we were also investing in city council races in the city of Fresno. Fresno is the fifth largest city in California, and it's a political hub. It's a cultural hub for the Central Valley as well. And so there is an opportunity to shift power up and down the Central Valley, including at local races all the way up to congressional races. And so this has an impact not only just within the Central Valley, but in the state. And if we're looking at this congressional race, there's impact nationally as well.
Thank you, Marisa. So, I mean, to underline what you're saying, I think, and to connect it to what Michael Taz was saying, right? There is a lot of young progressive leadership that gets overlooked, and not just leadership, but also voting as well. And so people sort of think of Central Valley as a monolith, but honestly, some of the most exciting dynamics and candidates come out of that area. So Very excited to have you here. Taina.
Hey everybody, my name is Taina Vargas. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the founder and executive director of Initiate Justice Action. We're a 501c4 that aims to end mass incarceration in California by activating the political power of those who are directly impacted by it. So our staff, board, membership are mostly people who are either formerly incarcerated or who have had incarcerated loved ones. And I'm based in Los Angeles, but we are a statewide organization. So for the primary election, we focus primarily on state and local candidates, on some progressive candidates running for state assembly, including, speaking of Central Valley, Sandra Celadon and Fresno County, who unfortunately did not make it forward. But also some really important races here in the city of Los Angeles, both for city council and citywide with the city attorney. In particular, really just focusing on candidates who are about investing in community, not in incarceration. And I think that, I know that we'll get into this more, but see, how more and more these candidates who are like really talking about making investments in community care, that message is really resonating more and more with voters. So while we didn't get everything that we wanted, it was really inspirational to see, how system impacted people in particular were able to make an impact on these local races.
Definitely. And I know in previous elections, we've seen public safety be like a very central issue. It can be one, I would say oftentimes law enforcement and opposition use to like stoke a lot of fear and like really turn out voters to vote against certain policies or vote against certain candidates. So we'll definitely want to talk about that more and how sort of public safety played into this election as well. Boomer, you want to introduce yourself now?
Yeah, hey everyone. My name is Bulmaro, but everyone calls me Boomer. My pronouns are he, him, él. I am representing Chispa. We are a political home for young Latina in Orange County. We do local and statewide advocacy around issues around like police accountability, economic justice, and immigrant rights. And we do that both local and statewide. And we've realized that honestly, like a lot of our barriers towards passing like progressive legislation are from moderate Democrats. To like Democrats that are bought out by special interests that are meddled with like police unions, apartments association, realtors, things around that. And so our focus is mainly towards candidates in Orange County. And we've actually had a pretty good win. Like I feel like Orange County has been known as really a very strong conservative groundhold. I feel like folks tend to affiliate Orange County with things like Disney, like Laguna Beach, HB, but there's more to that. There's a very vibrant, like mixed community here. And especially in cities like Santana, we're building a progressive branch of power. And so for this primary, we did endorse in a couple of races. Particularly in Orange County, we supported Orange County Supervisor Vicente Sarmiento, who won 60% of the vote. We supported Josie Lopez, who ran for 8068. She's a councilwoman in Santana, which is a huge win. We were with Josie when she first ran for city council in 2020. So it's amazing just to see her progression from Santana right now to pass the primaries for the Assembly race. And then for 8072, we endorsed Chris Cluey. So 8072 is actually a very unique assembly district because it's like the coastal areas, and so it's like Huntington Beach, Laguna Beach. And so there's also a very strong Republican House stronghold there too. And so we were able to get a very strong progressive Democrat actually to advance a primary. Chris Cluey is a former NFL star. He played, I forgot, oh my God, sorry. I'm not to football, so I don't know which team he played with, but I know he went really viral for really speaking out against the injustices of LGBTQ folks. And so really awesome guy. And I would say and I'll explain more later in terms of what we did, but Chispa is a very unique position because we're a multi-entity organization. And so we're not only a C3, but we have a C4 in our pack. And so we split our team, half of them are on the PAC side and half of them are working directly with the candidates themselves, which makes it helpful for us really to take advantage of all the resources that we can do.
Yes. So, I mean, to underscore a couple of things, like you mentioned, just echoing what Marisa said, right? It's like it's important to support these candidates when they're starting out, like at the local level, and that becomes sort of the pipeline upward towards state legislature, Congress, statewide office, sometimes national office. We'll see. But also, okay, if you don't remember what clip, I know American football is not the number one football right now. All right. Um, so some folks mentioned like different races and different candidates. Like Matt, I'd love for you to speak to, like, especially from the environmental perspective, what were some of the results that really stood out to you and why? And like, what do you think some of the results mean in terms of sort of like the climate agenda for California?
It's funny because my head jumps to like what needs to be dispelled. Because I think there are a lot of media narratives, especially when you look at the governor's race. We were saying, and I think still it's true, there's no single election in this country that's more important for climate action than who's going to be California's next governor. Being, the lead of the fourth or fifth largest economy and being a place where climate policy is innovated and then spread across the globe, it's so important. And also being the size of population we have and showing that we can, address the climate crisis and also continue to create more shared prosperity, which I think is the part of it that we still need to really work on. Um, but so that race was critical. And I think a lot of people said, well, um, Becerra and Steyer were the top two Dems who were competing kind of for who's going to make it to the general, potentially both of them. Um, and in that, I think a lot of people said, well, Becerra took oil money, but he has this great record on environmental justice from the past, right? And then you have Steyer, who's been a longtime climate like funder and someone who's really invested in building organization around the movement. Um, and but he had investments in the past that were also from like oil and gas like investments. And it really put climate and the relationship to oil and gas in the state at the center of that race, right? That was the distinguishing issue for a lot of that race. And for us, I think like we took it as I don't think people were saying, oh, this doesn't matter to us in this race. I think people were saying this absolutely does matter to us. And it's just a matter of which side of that you aligned with more. And for me, that shows that this value of one, protecting our environment, climate, and the health of people in California is a strong California value. And we also don't want candidates who are invested in and or supported by polluter industries. And I think for me, that's one of the big kind of takeaways and big races and narratives that really stood out to me in this election. The other things that really stood out to me in this election in terms of races, and something you spoke to earlier, Irene, was the amount of corporate money in a primary. More than I've seen in any given primary in the past, right? People really played their hand heavy in this election. And you saw that with some really sad losses that were races that we were hoping to win, like Fatima Iqbal Zubair in Assembly District 65, who Fatima actually is an environmental staff member, or former staff member, potentially future staff member again. And so like obviously we're very invested in her success in this race, and unfortunately, she did not get into the top two due to heavy, 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 heavy spending against her, right? And really dirty, nasty, racist, xenophobic, like ugly, like things being implied and or said about her. Um, the other races like Sandra Celedon, um, or in Fresno, right? Or Ana Palacio, like in Kern County. Other like three women of color who got heavy spending against them by industry to keep them out of office. And so that's something I think that we paid attention to. And I think what stood out to me in those races is not just like not the places we won, but like where we lost and why. And so that I think is something that people have already mentioned in the chat. Like we need to get the money out of politics. We need to really think about what does democracy look like and in California moving forward, and what role money is going to play in these elections, and how that may or may not influence who people were electing. And so for us, I think that's those races are examples of we really need to change what we're doing because we know where California's values are, but the resources it takes to win is conflating what's happening in these results.
Yeah, and I think to underscore what you mentioned too, I think research shows over and over, like as an example of a progressive climate agenda point, is like people want corporate polluters to pay for cleanup, remediation, and for their
Yep.
impacts and harms. And we have not been able to get many of these bills
Look at
through
this
the
fire
state
in Boyle
legislature.
Heights
Yeah,
right now.
yeah, yep,
This warehouse facility in Boyle
yep,
Heights right now, that's toxic air all around us because yeah.
yep.
And who's doing anything about it?
And it's because those moderate Democrats who
Yep.
get corporate, yes. Um, Again, and this are the same elected leaders who tend to also like toe the line for law enforcement, real estate. There's whole long list of things.
Yeah.
So thank you. So Taina, I also, Michael Tubbs had also mentioned that there are a lot of really interesting dynamics happening, especially in LA, where we're seeing a lot of race advance, where you have like a more moderate versus a progressive. And in some ways, even though Measure ER like just barely passed, it was like one of the few, local tax and revenue ballot measures that passed at the local level. So I'd love to hear you also speak to like what do you see as some of like the or uh, top election results or races that really stood out to you?
Yeah, so in LA, we're definitely seeing a huge battle between the moderate Dems and the progressive Dems at the city level, from the mayor to the citywide races like city attorney, and then down to the city council races. So starting with mayor, we're gonna have Karen Bass versus Nithya Raman, moderate Dem who I think Karen used to be a progressive and now has moved very much towards being a moderate Dem against, a progressive challenger on the city council. So that's something that I think is also getting national attention, almost similar to the attention that Mamdani was getting in New York City. So I think a lot of people are going to be looking at Los Angeles in terms of the mayor race to see if the progressive wave will hit here as well. For the citywide races, we, have already talked a lot about Marisa Roy for city attorney, which is so exciting to see her finish first and in a commanding first at over 43% and challenging an incumbent. Heidi, the incumbent, didn't even make it past the primary, which is the first time that this has happened in a citywide race in over 100 years in the city of LA. So, already making history there. But, once again, running against a moderate, more, tough on crime Democrat, John McKinney, who is, going to be for sure, fear mongering, and that's going to be a big challenge for those of us who support Marisa to overcome in November. Likewise, with our city controllers race, which is a nonpartisan race, and Kenneth Mejia, who is not a registered Democrat, his opponent is a registered Democrat. However, he ran his initial campaign, his reelection campaign, and has just been in office on a platform of radical transparency and has just been giving the people all the information that they need and deserve in terms of where the city's money is going, in particular overspending on law enforcement and lack of transparency and accountability. And he, got over 63% of the vote and won. So, I think that we saw our values there. Luckily, that's, one that's, we don't have to go to November for that one. And that, speaking of dirty money, I'll also share that his opponent's mother spent over $7 million to get her son elected in that race, which was insane. But then, just to get down to city council, so for a population of 4 million people, we only have 15 city council members. And that's something that we're working on. We're actually in the process of charter reform right now to try and expand the city council. But with 15 city council members, our magic number is 8. So, progressives like us in the city are like, okay, how do we get to 8 progressive members on the city council? Right now we have 4. And 2, and we alternated some even districts, one election cycle, odd districts, another election cycle. So the odd numbers are up this year. 2 of the progressive incumbents were up for re-election, both won outright and, were reelected to their seat, which is very exciting. But there were some progressive challengers as well, in particular in City Council District 9, Estuardo Mazariegos, who's the progressive running against the moderate staff member of the incumbent named Jose Ugarte. So that will be a really interesting one to watch. This district in particular is South LA, Central LA. So large historically Black community, historic Latino community, marginalized community. So who we have representing people in City Council District 9 is going to be huge as well. And then a loss that we unfortunately had was in City Council District 11, like the west side, like Santa Monica area, or not Santa Monica because it's another city. The beach. Faiza Malik was challenging the incumbent Tracy Park. Again, progressive versus I don't even know if I consider Tracy a moderate Dem. She's pretty.
Isn't she a Republican? I thought she was registered Republican.
She might be, and that would make a lot more sense. But yeah, and for Fiza, I'll say she knocked more than 100,000 doors, so more than any other candidate in city council district history in the city of Los Angeles. And the money spent against her was more than any other candidate in the history of LA city politics as well. So, there's a whole lot at stake here. We are making some progress. We are continuing to fight. We've been able to at least like protect our wins, protect our incumbents who are doing a very good job, challenge some incumbents who are doing a very bad job. But recognizing the size of the city of Los Angeles and the implications that it has not only for the state, but for nationwide as well, we definitely have a lot of work going into November.
Yeah, I hear you on that. I mean, I do think even if not all of the progressives made it to a general election, what's exciting is that we're having these kinds of races in the first place. Like, it seems like not too long ago, it's like we could maybe like run these kinds of races in like 1 or 2, and now it's like starting to really broaden. So I find that really exciting. All right, so Marisa, I know that Power California Action, like you mentioned, was very active in the field. What what were some of the things that you were seeing out there as you were talking to voters? Like, what kind of messaging was working with them? What was getting them excited to vote? Like, yeah, what were you hearing out in the field?
Sure. So I do want to name that as an alliance, but also with our work in the Central Valley, we're doing year-round voter engagement. So we're talking to voters constantly. And so we are prepared to jump into opportunities like the primary election, and we're going to do the same in the general, ready to talk to voters about the issues that they care about. And we've known this since 2023 probably, but it was really evident in 2024. What folks and what voters care about the most is what's going to impact their day-to-day lives. And right now, what's top of mind is the economy and the economic crisis. That was the number one thing we were hearing at the doors. It wasn't saving democracy. It's the cost of living is increasing every single day. Groceries are so expensive. Gas is so expensive. By PG&E or SoCal Edison, like my utilities bills, right, keep going up. And ultimately, what was also driving voters to, especially in the Randy Villegas race, where we had an independent expenditure field team in Fresno, what was driving folks to be connected to Randy as a candidate was that he was corporate free, because folks have been burned too many times by corporations. And those are the individuals, those corporations, but also the billionaires, right, that are empowering our opposition and continuing to profit off the backs of the working class community. Those are the folks that are continuing to drive up the cost of living and impact their day-to-day lives. So I just want to name that's going to be important to continue to dig into, especially in the Central Valley, where though there was an increase in voter turnout, it's still a generally lower voter turnout area. For Congressional District 22 is a 25% voter turnout, which is what was projected. But we were hearing projections from out of state groups or national groups, just sort of broader statewide groups, like, no, it's gonna be 30, 35%. I'm like, I appreciate the optimism, the enthusiasm, but realistically, it's going to be a lower turnout, though there was an increase. And we need to make sure we're connecting with voters on that lived reality and their experience there. I also want to name, though, that there's an increasing, not increasing, but there is also concern from voters just about how their communities have been under attack. Increased ICE presence and folks that they know who have been deported or been detained by ICE. There's multiple processing centers up and down the Central Valley, and folks are impacted by that. And I think this is also true for other parts of inland California, but as we focus on Central Valley and also races that we're gearing up for in Fresno, folks want their cost of housing to be stabilized, to go down. We want to make sure that folks have affordable health care. We're in a healthcare like desert in a lot of areas in the Central Valley as well, where it's not even just a lack of um, like good doctors, it's just a lack of access where hospitals actually get shut down. And we know that with HR1 that was passed last year, that impact is going to continue to grow exponentially. We already have members that have lost their healthcare access this month, and that's going to continue to happen. And so folks also want to hear, how am I going to get my healthcare coverage back? What about my parents that are retiring? What's going to happen with them? And again, going back to these day-to-day lived experiences and holding corporations accountable.
Thank you, Marisa. And I think that also speaks to the power of candidates who are very focused on speaking with members of the community, like directly, and know very specifically about like what's happening in the region. Like you said, what hospitals are closing, how many people are affected by the healthcare cuts, and being able to speak directly to them. So Boomer, I know that you're also like enjoying the goal that was just scored by Mexico, but I'd love to hear from you, like Orange County. I mean, you and I were talking about sort of like both what you were hearing out the doors, but also like some of the mailers and the ads that folks were seeing in the Orange County. I mean, as I think folks have already mentioned, like some of these ads got pretty dirty, pretty nasty. It was like not a dynamic we like to see, but it's something that we just see, especially with a lot of these like big corporate PACs. So yeah, say more about what you saw and heard in Orange County.
Okay, yes. First, I just want to say Viva Mexico. Oh yeah. My family's just like all loud in the background. But I would say on the I'm sorry, what was your question again?
Yeah, what were you seeing and hearing in Orange County this primary election? Like what were voters subjected to in terms of ads and mailers, but also what were you guys hearing at the doors as you were making direct voter contacts?
Okay. So on the specifically on the 86-8 race against Jesse, we were hearing a lot at the doors just because there was millions being spent against her. Um, if y'all live in Santana or in that area, people just saw nonstop like YouTube ads. They saw AI mailers, these like disgusting AI mailers. And the thing about Jessie is that she's battle tested. You know, she faced the recall in 2023 and she defeated that recall. And so voters are kind of like used to that information. But also, like, they were attacking her on things like not paying her rent, you know, like everyday issues that like people face. And so one of the things that kind of we did to kind of counter that as Chispa, both on the coordinated side and through our pack side, was we did ads in support of her. You know, ads really distinguishing the candidates between the moderate Democrat and the progressive Dems. Like in terms of really, you know, who's backing who. We did an attack ad on David, which was our first attack ad. And we highlighted specifically on who was supporting his race. And that really resonated with voters. And I feel like voters got fatigue in terms of these like hate mailers on Jesse. And once they began learning more about like what the issue was and who was backing who, I think like voters understood the fact of like, okay, like now we see really who the progressive candidate is. And I feel like all of the opponent's messaging was like anti-Jesse. And I think that really rubbed voters the wrong way. And it also just looked very misogynistic, like attacking a woman of color. Um, and so I feel like that really resonated a lot with voters. But I feel like that public educational component was really critical on our part, was really helping close that gap, but really helping counter that messaging and counter the attack ads that they were doing on Jesse by doing more Jesse ads or by doing an attack ad on David. And so that was really helpful on our end. And we were able to do that both through our C4 side and also within our pack.
Yeah, and I mean, for me, this also emphasizes that, people traditionally look for like Democrat versus Republican to sort of like just distinguish between candidates and figure out to vote for. But in these races where we're seeing more Democrats run against each other, it's it takes a lot more work to educate people about like what are the differences between the two and trying to get ahead of sort of like the negative spending that again comes from the more moneyed industry and corporate side. But okay, so now we're through the primary election. We know who's running for the different seats. Um, I see another goal. Okay. Um, so I'd love to also hear, Boomer, like, what are you what are you looking at in terms of the November election? What are some of your priorities, and how should folks here on this call and listening in the future, like, how should folks be thinking about this November general election?
So I feel like there's a lot of excitement towards the general election, and I think voter turnout is going to be really important. I think that was what really helped really shape the lead in Jesse's race was that she ended up third in election night, but I think voter turnout and like voters really helped her move to the top two. Um, and just I think also door knocking, really meeting voters at the doors and sharing information, and also being able to really like counter the narrative that we're going to be seeing like a lot on these progressive candidates. Um, and I think that's the messaging that we're going to be seeing a lot from, or that's a tactic we're going to be seeing a lot from like the modern Dems. Um, and I think lastly, I think down ballot is going to be really important, like having slates of candidates. And that's kind of the strategy that we're going to be using in the fall. Um, I'm gonna brag a little bit, but at Chispa, we have a track record of building candidates, eh, like within our membership program, and so, um, but also within our staff. And so we have two staff members that are running in Santa Ana. We have one of our members that is running for Santa Ana City Council, um, and we have Jesse and our endorsed candidates, and so we're using like our sort of the ground and the base that we've been building to help build a progressive bench and essentially building an Avengers of really like progressive candidates and electeds that will help us sweep November. And I think we saw that in New York with the Mamdani slate, whatever you want to call it. But I think that was really effective. And I think we should learn from that as well.
Yeah. And I should say too, you're the executive director of Chispa. Isuri Ramos is running for Santa Ana City Council. And I just want to flag here that Courage has endorsed her in that race, and obviously so is Chispa. So one race in Canada to so keep an eye out for the general election. Marisa, I'm curious to hear your thoughts too about what you're thinking about for the general election and what you think folks should be also paying attention to for November.
Yeah, so as we think about November, as Parsi Action, we're obviously not concerned, sorry, focused on youth turnout and young voter turnout. But I think it's important to note that, especially in the Central Valley, this is a really young area. And so there actually is a lot of untapped potential in reaching out to our young folks and young voters of color. And there is a growing electorate of young people in the Central Valley who are turning out as well. So though it still may be lower than we'd like, the percentage of youth voter turnout in the region has been increasing year by year. And that's thanks to work that's happening at the C3 level, but also C4. And I think ultimately it's having candidates that are exciting as well. We're in a really opportune moment, especially in the Central Valley, where there are candidates that we can be excited about rather than having to pick between like I think they're maybe a little bit sometimes better than this other person, and usually it's like a moderate candidate. So not only with Randy Villegas is that proof of excitement, um, and being able to support issues around affordability, but also be a champion for working families. But this is also true in the city of Fresno, where we've also endorsed Ariana Martinez-Lott running for city council. And then there's other candidates that we'll be looking at for the general election as well. But there are more and more candidates that are really going to be showing up for working families. Really quick on that City of Fresno piece, I just want to note that if folks aren't aware, so it's a city council of seven, three seats are going to be brand new positions in 2026. And then two of those seats are folks that just entered in the last year. So this is a very new council, and this is a council that has the opportunity to really shift power over the next decade. So we need to be investing in these local races as well, in addition to these big races like the congressional race. I think lastly, I also just want to note that as we're considering and engaging in work in the November election, it's important that we're also letting the local on the ground orgs lead and build strategy and really listen to and making sure we're building narrative strategies, field strategies, right, based on the expertise of folks on the ground as well. Especially the Central Valley becomes an area where a lot of groups just like parachute in and out. But I think we're seeing a lot more like trust building that's happening across groups to lean into the expertise that's on the ground as well. So we're excited to also be in partnership with groups to make that happen.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I love the work you guys do because, like you said, this is year-round work, right? It is that sort of trust building and relationship building. Because, I mean, we've seen national or like party aligned groups come in and they're like, honestly, like really lazy about their campaigns, and they're also trying to go for likely voters. People have turned out like election by election. So they're really missing this key electorate. Whereas I feel like Power C Action and a lot of the other groups like are very focused on this idea of like long-term relationship building, long-term power building. And so it is like you got to get these young folks as they're thinking about voting, about the issues. And then hopefully like it becomes this habit forming thing of like they continue to vote year after year. But then I mean, I think just as exciting that we're seeing, as Boomer mentioned, in County and happening in Central Valley, but LA everywhere is like we're seeing also a lot more candidates coming with from the background of community organizing and from the grassroots running for office too. So Taina, tell me, what are you looking at in terms of November, and what would you encourage folks to start to really engage on or pay more attention to for November too?
Yeah, and I'll try and keep it short because I'm keeping an eye on the time too. I think that the most important thing for us, especially after, reflecting on some of the data that you shared at the beginning of this presentation, Irene, is like really making sure that we're mobilizing our folks to show up. We see this time and time again that it's young folks, that it's people of color who are not showing up in as big numbers as, folks who are 65 years or older and white. And then, we wonder why we see policies that are, reflected to protect a certain group of folks when our folks, are not having our voices heard at the ballot box. So definitely going to have a huge focus on making sure that we're mobilizing our own communities, that they have all the resources and information that they need to cast an informed ballot, and make sure that they're there. And then prioritize a lot of these really close races. I think most of the progressive candidates who we supported, probably a lot of folks that other folks supported as well. On election night, they were in third place, maybe even, in fourth, they were distant third. And it took, like counting up all of the votes for them to just, barely make it over the threshold. Or some races like Fatima's race, is very close within 1% of the vote. So I think just like really making sure that We recognize that every single vote counts in our progressive races in particular, so just really making sure that our communities show up.
Thanks, Taina. And it's funny because I feel like people may get tired of hearing like every vote counts, but it really, really does. Like you mentioned, like sometimes I just remember the heartbreak of losing a couple races just by like a few hundred votes. And it was, yeah, don't want to deal with that again in 2026. All right, so to wrap up this panel, Matt, I'd love to hear also your thoughts. Like, what are you and Enviro voters thinking about for November, and how should folks be starting to engage on some of that now?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there's some legislative races that we have an opportunity to flip or win that are going to be very exciting. Like candidates like Clarissa Cervantes, I mean, Jessica Lopez, making sure she wins that race. Um, and the thing that I think is going to get most attention this general election is going to be the congressional races, right? I mean, not every congressional race in every part of the state is going to be incredibly competitive. Prop 50 took care of that, but there's a couple, and 22 is like probably the race I think will probably be the closest race in this election in California. And the good thing that I think this election showed us, and I'll also tie this to the governor's race too a little bit, is that they've tried the strategy of running a corporate Democrat against Valadeo cycle after cycle, and they keep losing in a seat that is a Democratic seat by registration. And what's happening? Young people and young progressives, especially, aren't turning out for a candidate that they see no different than the Republican candidate that they're running against, right? And I also think that's going to be something Becerra's going to also need to do is how figure out how he appeals to young progressive voters in the general election so that he can inspire them to turn out. Because if we saw what Kamala did at the top of the ticket in California, we saw a lower turnout in California or depressed turnout in California than what we would have expected, right, in a presidential election year. And also the kinds of people who turned out weren't the progressive voters in the state. And what that led to is a less progressive result. And then you had the legislature see that, get spooked and scared and say, oh, we need to run to the middle. And then that's the opposite thing we need to do because if you look at New York, what happened? And so I think what we need to look at and make sure that candidates in California remember is that in order to get to your 50 plus one, building a progressive coalition also matters. You also have to persuade the middle, right? In some of those places where you have to do that. But don't 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 underestimate the value of inspiring people to come out and vote because you stand for something.
Well, here, Matt. I mean, it's sort of like what Michael Dubs was saying, was he had a progressive agenda, but he clearly appealed to folks who identified as progressive and folks who did not. And I mean, I think that's the argument we all like to make, which is that a progressive agenda and progressive policies really benefit the most number of people and has the broadest appeal. And of course, like the Democratic establishment refuses to learn, despite all these things. They always want to say, like, oh, this is the exception or this. But, I want to, like, several of you guys have now mentioned the Randy race. We have also endorsed Randy and we're really excited about it. I'm hoping it's not going to be a close race. I would love to see like this to be a total blowout and a total rejection of Valadeo. But like you said, Matt, like it's also a rejection of this idea of like we need centrist or moderate or corporate back candidates to win. We just really need these leaders who understand the district, are from the district, come from these communities, and what they campaign on and care about reflects the needs. Like Marisa mentioned, like there's just so much around healthcare, around cost of living, and people need to feel like their issues are being directly addressed. And they're not necessarily hearing that from, definitely not hearing that from Republicans, and definitely not hearing it from a lot of the moderate Democrats. So thank you, Matt. Thank you, Taina. Thank you, Marisa. And thank you, Boomer, for joining us. This was really fun to have this conversation. I think there's even more stuff to unpack as the results get more finalized and we get to dig a little bit deeper into what turnout looked like and like who voted for what and like that. But we also have this huge opportunity in front of us, like you guys mentioned. So, I mean, as we all talked about, like there's definitely a few disappointing results. Like there were some progressive candidates that didn't make it into the top two. But overall, like I do feel like the election results are really promising for the November 3rd general election. So both in terms of turnout, but also some of the candidates who did make it through. But I think as we all mentioned, right, like Californians clearly understand what's at stake with this election and they're motivated to vote, especially when they have exciting candidates to vote for. But, like I also want to be a little bit cautious of like, we also don't want to take anything for granted like we have in previous election cycles. We know it's going to take a lot of work to turn out voters, and we want to see voter turnout to be, again, like really high and historic. But we also know that for this election, the Trump administration is going to keep just trying to throw up all these barriers to keep people from being able to vote. So whether that be trying to curtail mail-in voting, trying to send law enforcement and ICE to the polls or near the polls, spreading a lot of disinformation. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. So just to speak for Courage, what we're also looking forward to, as all these folks mentioned, is like really turning out a lot of voters for November. But I also want to mention too a couple of things that we didn't get to talk about in this panel, which is there's going to be more statewide ballot measures as well for this November. So I know several of us are part of committees or working against sort of the voter ID ballot measure that would prevent and keep eligible voters from voting. But there's also some good things that we want to drive people towards. Like we will have the opportunity to lift the ban on public financing around the state on the November ballot. And fingers crossed, if the legislature passes it by tomorrow, we're also gonna be able to look at an $11 billion housing bond on the November ballot as well. So again, like some exciting things to turn people out for, but also some things we still have to fight against. And then at Courage, like these folks on the call with us, like we're going to endorse in more races up and down the ballot, especially where we see opportunities to flip seats from Republican to progressive Democrats, and especially at the state legislative level. We'll also have our Courage Voter Guide, where we're going to cover all the statewide races, congressional races, state legislative races, and the statewide ballot measures. Plus, we're hoping to sweep up a couple of the county and local races that folks have mentioned here. And then, obviously, in order to reach as many Californians as possible, we want to be able to translate our voter and election resources into Spanish and several API languages. And then I'm hoping you'll see some of these same faces that you see here with us tonight for some events and other ways to turn out voters for November. We also want to create a lot more information for voters and for partners as well. Because as I mentioned, there are a lot of federal threats and attacks on our voting and election rights, but there's also some work by our state leaders to try to protect California voters in our elections as well. So we want to make sure folks are up to date on what their voting rights are and how to vote. And then as we talked about, the running theme around this too, right, is like we especially want to focus on turning out younger voters, Latino and other voters of color, first-time voters, right? In California, we're a big enough state where there's like thousands and thousands of new voters every single election. And we also want to make sure we are talking to Democratic and no party preference voters because we need to be able to flip the House, elect more progressive leaders up and down the ballot, and of course, pass progressive ballot measures. And then all of us together, once we get through the November election, then we start turning right away to hold those elected leaders accountable once they're in office. So obviously a lot to do for November, a lot of energy, a lot of momentum to build from. Hopefully all these fireworks and celebrations that you guys are hearing for the World Cup is just like, we're just going to carry that energy and momentum into November and beyond. But we'll start with November, or at least for you guys, at least for the match today, and then the next that are coming up. So I hope you all are ready. It's obviously going to be a very intense and exciting 4 months from now through November 3rd. And it's going to take all of us to turn out every voter we can across the state. So thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Go Mexico, go whatever team you're cheering for the World Cup. But really go California, because we need to make sure, again, we have 40 million people around the state. many or most of those people are eligible to vote and aren't registered to vote or aren't turning out to vote. And we need to make sure that we get every single person in California who's eligible to vote. Because all of these races, every single vote really does matter, and especially in races up and down the ballot. So thank you all so much for joining us. We'll keep providing updates on the election, and we will look forward to seeing you as we gear up for the general election soon. Thank you all. Have a good night. Celebrate all the good wins out there. And thank you all.